Oh, here we go. Hey, everybody. Happy Wednesday. Happy day 4,000 of our continuation of the COVID year. Pleased to be with you guys today for Adaptability, Unlocking the Keys to Work. We're going to have a little fun today. Quick housekeeping note. Mary had an unfortunate emergency occur literally 5 minutes ago, so you are stuck with me. I will do my best to represent the wonderful Miss Mary Faulkner, and we wish her and her family all the best with this unexpected urgency that just came up. But before we get started, we wanted to do a quick shout out to today's sponsor. Michelle, would you mind?
Of course. Atria would like to thank Acura Background for sponsoring today's webinar content. Acura Background is a leading provider of compliant, automated workforce screening solutions. Leveraging proprietary technology and superior service, over 16,000 global organizations trust them to mitigate risk, reduce costs, and deliver a positive candidate screening experience. Now, background checks are a breeze. Their full suite of compliance screening services lets you verify candidate backgrounds without sacrificing individualized attention or cutting any corners. To learn how Accurate Background can help you make effective hiring decisions, visit accurate.com.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you, Accurate. Okay, so we're going to talk about adaptability today, but let's talk about what we're actually going to cover. You're on mute. You guys know you're on mute. By the way, who's the person that's in every meeting that loves to tell everybody that they're on mute? You know who those people are. And then the moment that you come off mute, you lost your mojo because they stole it. Thanks, person who does that literally every single virtual conference call. But you are on mute today. Thank you, WebEx producer. It's usually me. Thanks for the call out. You are on mute today, but we do want this to be as engaging as possible. So please use the panel to submit your questions and answers. This great team who's producing today's event will queue up those questions, attempt to triage anything around usability or technology, but then anything on the content, we're going to save some time at the end to be able to address it. So thanks in advance for your patience, but you are on mute, and I do see you as full humans. Thank you. So today we're going to cover three major topics. One, we're going to start with a reality check. You were probably sick and tired of talking about the COVID impact, but we have a couple key things that we wanted to call out in terms of setting the table in a little bit of a different context. Maybe some of these things you've read, but I want to pull those out and I want to thread them into this notion of adaptability in sort of the very fluid environment that we live in today. Then, of course, we want to get to the meat of what we're here to talk about is what are some potential solutions, some really new approaches to be able to manage this unpredictable world that we find ourselves in. And then, of course, you can stalk us. We engage you guys to hunt us down on LinkedIn, Twitter. If you're out there tweeting, thank you. And we'll open up for the Q&A session. And one funny little note. So right before we were getting ready for today's webinar, we found out that there were 666 people that were registered. So we put out a tweet. And Alex, if you're out there, a quick shout out to Alex Murphy. Thank you for saving us from, I guess, eternal damnation and getting us to 667 registrants. So thanks, Alex. We're glad that you're here today. All right. So let's talk about this notion of amplification. So for many of you, you've probably experienced this as employers, as HR professionals, as managers, just as individual contributors. This COVID impact, right, that we're still in the midst of, I hate almost referring to this as the post-COVID world because by no means are we out of the impact of COVID today. Hopefully you all are able to get vaccinated. I think I'll be last in line. But COVID amplified what we believe has always been true with our people. And there's a couple kind of frightening statistics that have come out that I really want to spend a little bit of time walking through you today. So PwC, great firm, they do this annual survey, and in their remote survey, what they recently found from executives is that 68% of the executives that they surveyed, there were many hundreds of executives, said, listen, we expect actually, despite everything that's happened, despite remote work, we expect that your employees are actually going to return to the office. And not only do we expect it, we expect that employees are going to be back into the office about 3 days a week. And half employees, though, over half of employees, we see the 68%, over half of the employees that were surveyed say, listen, I actually expect to be able to work from home or work from a remote location 3 days a week. So we have this constant tension, which again, I think has always been true between the flexibility and necessity of a work-life balance, embracing what we believe is the output of our work versus the attendance of our work. But the amplification of this issue now under COVID is the fact that we have largely, with the exception of many millions of populations, been remote workers, particularly knowledge workers. But what we're finding, and it's a bit unfortunate from my perspective, is that there is a drive by senior executives to bring people back into the office. But there is a recognition that what one has gained from this remote work environment, I would like to hold on to. And if you think about this even from a recruiting standpoint, right? If you're in the talent acquisition space, you've perhaps been committed or permitted to cast a wider net in finding talent. You're hitting geographies you've never hit before. Why? Because you've proven, and the data supports this, that productivity is actually up. But guess what else is up? Stress, exhaustion, mental well-being has never been challenged like it is today. So what we know is true is there is still tension from the notion of independence and the ability to produce a work product from whatever location against the desire and the protectionism of traditional executive oversight. In addition now, and this has certainly been shocking for a lot of people, a disproportionate impact has been felt by women over men. And when we talk about this notion of exacerbating, and I mean really exacerbating the inequality between our male and female workers, nothing has been more true than in COVID. So Oxford Economics and McKinsey put out a study where they were looking at the projection of when we, quote, return to equality or return to normalcy. We've got a long way to go with equality. Let me just recognize that. But if we look at pure population demographics, by what year and what date do we believe that we'll return to the demographic prevalence of men and women in the workplace? And this is shocking. They believe that men will return to the workplace by 2022. We will return to pre-COVID levels of employment. But for women, there is a 2-year gap. Think about that, a 2-year gap just to get to where we were in early 2020. If that doesn't concern you as employers, concern you for those that are focused on diversity, equity, inclusion, it certainly concerns me as a people leader. And we have to be very intentional about unpacking the reasons beyond this disparity. But when we look at quotes, let's say Fortune just put this out. We saw this from September of last year, and you may have even seen in the December jobs report that in December, women accounted for all of the net job losses. Get your mind around that for just a minute. It accounted for all the net job losses. And then when school year, right, when we went to remote learning, 80% of the 1.1 million, and this is just for those that are here in the United States, who exited the workforce for women. So women are still carrying a disproportionate burden of their household. This may be children, this may be aging parents, this may be any combination of impacts. But the reality is that we have always had issues with equality in the workplace. This has amplified and exacerbated those issues. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? And how are we going to move forward? And what I want to call out also, if you don't know, next Monday is International Women's Day. And the theme, what's the theme for International Women's Day on March the 8th? The global theme for International Women's Day, it's women in leadership, and I'm reading this here, achieving an equal future in a COVID-19 world. So we as a global body of individuals, right, with lives and with careers, need to recognize this disparity and need to be active and intentional about what we're going to do about it. This is a critical part of our reality check. Okay, let's move on between those demographic issues, which are real people, by the way, I don't mean to disqualify it, to actual process issues. So the other thing that we've experienced in this reality check is all the problems that exist already today with our processes. So the paper chase is still alive. We have all these great technical advances. You might use DocuSign, you might use all these things, but here's the reality. Paper is still a dominant and prevalent part of every process in the employee life cycle. Depending on the legal guidance and counsel you're getting, you may still be getting guidance that wet signatures are still required for various portions of your onboarding processes, that attestations are no longer available, et cetera. And even the most thought-provoking, thought-leading, high-tech firms in the world are still pushing and collecting and scanning and archiving and shredding loads and loads of paper. We are wasting a lot of the environment in doing so, but we're certainly wasting a lot of time. And what's especially difficult, I was talking to a large employer the other day, and some of the questions that they're getting from their new joiners, and certainly those that are existing in their processes, is, are you going to reimburse me for stamps? Are you going to reimburse me for the fact that I have to actually sign the paper, put the paper in an envelope, return the paper? Are you sending self-addressed stamped envelopes, right? This is a problem. So we have never had a greater impetus to move to a paperless process, but we have to decide what we're going to do with all the old paper and how we're going to basically eradicate this from our current approaches. Timeliness, we've always had issues. Let's say you have the most modern HR technology in the world and you're workflowing and workflowing and workflowing. Well, even the most modern HCM solutions, you still have key person dependencies. And there was always the ability, right, when we were on premise to do that hallway nudge, to give Jim a little elbow and say, Jim, hey, we're stuck in this approval process. You haven't done your performance reviews. We're waiting for you to approve the merit budget for your population. You haven't completed your annual enrollment process, whatever it is. We can't nudge unless we're intentional about nudge. So we have these issues with timeliness and stakeholder responsiveness and key person dependencies. So what are we going to do about that in a virtual world where work hours are perhaps a little bit more variable than ever been? And we have no way, in many cases, to actually personally nudge the person. So timeliness has become a huge barrier to process efficiency and actually moving ourselves through the employer workflows. Infrastructure, oh my goodness. Shout out to our IT peers who instantly tried to figure out how to securely and scalably distribute a number of devices and/or to technologically enable the devices that people already have at home. Technical support has been challenged. Heightened issues around security. Used to be as long as you plugged in the office, you got the automatic updates, where maybe they're having trouble virtually distributing the automatic updates. So you're getting behind, you're not doing your security protocols, et cetera, and bandwidth, right? If I start to freeze and spin, you all understand it because we're all working from home. Well, guess what? The infrastructure is as imperfect as it's ever been. And then this notion of collaboration. Organic relationships were always built in the workplace. You would grab a lunch, you would grab a coffee, you would find a way to connect with the individuals with whom you spend, frankly, a disproportionate part of your life. But now it's almost a little bit awkward, right? This reality check that we're facing is unless we're intentional about creating personal connection, even if you're scheduling a one-on-one, do you remember every one-on-one to start with the question of, how are you? And when somebody is tempted to say fine, to double click and say, but how are you really? Because that was a natural part of our collaboration as fellow humans. And now we have to schedule it. Now we have to Slack and we have to email and we have to, God forbid, right, pick up our phones and use a regular telephone call to connect with our fellow humans. But these issues of collaboration, infrastructure, timeliness, paper, and the predecessor processes, they've always existed. This has just amplified the problem. When we talk about other real problems that we're finding in the market in general, it is difficult right now. It is more difficult than it has ever been in many cases for certain individuals to thrive and for certain processes to actually be effective in the outcomes that they're trying to drive. Something that's horribly painful to watch right now. And for those of you that have kids that are graduating from high school or those that are graduating from trade schools or in the arts or graduating from traditional universities, our graduate population has never been more in limbo and therefore been held back in their ability to progress their career in a meaningful and notional way like generations prior. The International Monetary Fund, the IMF, right, put out a study and it's called The Long Shadow of an Unlucky Start. And this is outlining arguably a pretty bleak outcome where the data suggests that, I quote, youth who graduate in a crisis will be profoundly affected and may never fully recover. And how bad is this really for graduates? There's even a site called ismyinternshipcanceled.com where you can go to that site. It's a real site, ismyinternshipcanceled.com, and you can search for an employer name and see if your internship got canceled. So even those that were doing their best, right, in their good graces, their particular craft or domain, they can't find a start. They even can't find a start for paid or unpaid internships, and that's become very challenging. Okay. Virtual recruiting and onboarding. Gartner cites that 89%, not 90%, 89% of organizations have shifted to virtual recruiting. Why? Necessity, right? Necessity is the art of design here. But for some, that means, as I talked about earlier, casting a wider geographic net, which is fantastic. But you're also getting more candidates. So we're seeing much of a change, obviously, in talent acquisition where you're posting to career sites that you may be open to a virtual location. But can we live up to that promise? And frankly, HR got crushed pretty heavily like they do in every single recession, which includes both your internal and external recruiting partners. So although there is a market of plenty potentially now because you can cast a wider net geographically and hit candidates from all over the nation, the downside of that is the necessity for you to put pure human effort in and or to apply artificial intelligence, which has its own challenges, to attempt to qualify and pre-qualify those candidates in volume. So your volume metrics, obviously with the larger pool of unemployed, a larger candidate geographic reach with your limited and perhaps reduced resources has created a collision that's very difficult for people to overcome. And then we talk about this backlog of background checks. So let's say you are one of those fortunate employers who is hiring today, and we find this with a number of our employers. The courts may not be open, right? Universities may not be responsive if they're not using traditional university systems. So as a result, you're ready to finally onboard. You have these positions. You're ready to grow your organization in certain roles and certain responsibilities. But at no fault to the background check vendors, they literally cannot get the information and extract the information out of the court systems. And depending on where you are geographically, right, those court delays can be weeks and in some cases can be months. And how does that feel for a candidate experience? That's a horrible experience. So as an employer, are you being candid and transparent in acknowledging that obstacle and reaching out to your candidates to not only explain the delay, but explain the why in the delay? Because I think we all understand the world that we're living in right now, but are we being hyper transparent? And are we taking that extra effort to communicate for those candidates, frankly, that we're keenly interested in, that there is a delay? It's not a tooling delay. It's a process delay because of the human impact that we find ourselves in. And one of the worst, frankly, that we're seeing is this notion of long-term unemployment. Mary actually had an article that was posted via ERE yesterday that you guys should take a look at, and I wish she was here to speak to this. But there's some pretty shocking data about the impacts to those that are long-term unemployed. So CNBC data, there was a report from CNBC, I won't show you the chart obviously. 40% of unemployed workers have been out of work for in excess of 6 months. 40% of those that are unemployed. And this is approaching a historical peak of 45% through the 08-09 recession of those that were long-term unemployed. So again, as we're seeking to grow, to backfill positions, are we basically approaching those candidates with grace and acknowledging the fact that long-term unemployment is something that should be met with empathy and not disdain? We should not penalize and be punitive toward those that unfortunately we're working for organizations that could no longer survive or thrive as a result of something that largely was out of everybody's control. So let's be very intentional about the long-term unemployed and think about those impacts and how we secure those candidates with the same grace and care that we do for every other candidate, because this crisis, I fear, is only going to grow and extend. So these are real obstacles to the area that we find ourselves in. So let's do a time check. We spent 20 minutes. Those are all the problems. There's 100 more problems. But what I want to talk about now is I want to shift to this notion of what are we going to do about it? And let's talk about a couple potential solutions. How are we going to thread this needle? How are we going to find ourselves to pick a couple lanes and to pick a couple key care abouts as organizations that we can focus on disproportionately to acknowledge that the world has changed, to acknowledge that we may not want to retreat back to those imperfect processes and approaches, but that we have to be, as I've said in every single slide that we've shared thus far, you have to be very intentional. And you have to be very mindful about how we're going to actually move through this period and create that new world order and perpetuate that on an ongoing basis. So the good folks at Deloitte, we're always fans of Deloitte's research. They put out a really good definitional structure for this notion of teams. So what's a team? You think you know what a team is. Have you thought about the different characteristics of team, right? Independent members, we're working on a shared goal. We can kind of get our minds around that. When we talk about a leadership team, right, and leadership turnover, by the way, boy, we work with C-suites of the Global 1000 every single day. I have never seen the amount of turnover in the C-suite as I have, I'd say, in the last 18 to 24 months. But what is a leadership team responsible for? They run an organization. They may run a country, a region, a business unit. If you're a multifaceted holding company, I may be running a brand or an entity if I'm a house of brands. But we have a leadership team, right, with roles and responsibilities that are typically quite clear. Even leadership teams themselves, when we're seeing turnover, those are being shaken up and they're becoming more dynamic. We're seeing, for example, the insertion of co-CEOs or co-presidents, right, where there's an acknowledgement that we're stronger, perhaps splitting the duties of a singular role. So even the leadership team at times is becoming more dynamic in the work outcomes that they produce. Then we have project-based leadership, right? This is a major initiative. It might be a merger. It might be an acquisition. It might be a strategic omni-channel initiative if you're in retail. It might be, acquiring and growing hospital systems if you're in healthcare, whatever it may be. But the idea here is that these are teams that are perhaps extracted from the business, and they're typically 100% dedicated with other designated roles to support a major outcome that will foundationally change the nature of the businesses in which they operate. So we're talking about obviously extracting either whole and or fractional individuals to participate in this particular team. Then we think about something like HR transformation, right? You might have an HR transformation initiative, God forbid, right? That all of us are doing that. So this is execution focused, right? We have KPIs, we have outcomes, we have typically a fixed time horizon. And under that, we're executing toward that particular outcome. It may be customer facing, it may be about shareholders and stakeholders, it may be for the business, for your employees, whatever it is. But what I've done is I've taken fractional teams, largely, I've dynamically assembled them for the purpose of a particular outcome, but largely those individuals are still occupying their core roles. And I'll explain why we care about all this in a minute. And then we have this notion of project-based teams, which we're finding many organizations are moving toward for all of their employees. And this may be a new concept for some of you, but let me just spend a minute on the notion of dynamic teams and why it's important. There is a recognition that we as humans rarely do the one job that we were hired for. You may have had a job description, the job description was posted, you were hired into that, and oh my gosh, over my 28 years of my professional career, how many times on day one when I met my first manager did I sit down in here? So, we appreciate you joining the organization. The job's changed just a little bit, right? It's Q2, our performance changed a little bit. So as a result, yes, you're still doing these things, but we need you to do these 3 things. You're going to be working with Jane on these 4, and you're going to be working with Damon on these 8, etc. So the reality is that we're all in dynamic teams. We really just don't recognize it. Even in the manufacturing world, we work with a lot of manufacturers. How does a manufacturing line work? You get an order, you're producing perhaps a bespoke good and product, you're assembling your line, you're literally constructing your line, you're looking into your pool of skilled resources, you're pulling those common skills necessary, you're organizing and you're executing to produce to a particular outcome. My wife works in the fashion and luxury industry. Think about every time that you go to a factory to produce a shirt, right? Everything that you've ever worn has been produced. Guess what they do? They run a line. The line and the input for that line, the fabric, the buttons, the facing. I know all this, of course, because I live with a fashion person. All of that is dynamic. Why? Because that's just the nature of business. That's the nature of servicing their customers. What that means, however, for HR, in the context of this perpetual change, is a dynamic team today is probably comprised of both full-time employees and part-time employees and contingent labor pools, right? Which may include gig workers that are part-time and or full-time contingent labor. Those contingent labor pools could be assembled through a staffing agency, right? Who focuses on a particular vertical or horizontal skill set. And you may be virtually sitting together now, doing the same work, trying to produce the same outcome, but you are fractionally allocated to that work, either in the performance of that work over a time horizon, let's say, for a fixed 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, or actually as a fractional portion of your everyday. But here's the thing we don't do, and we don't do quite well, and frankly, our technology has not prepared us to do quite yet. We haven't thought about the pay structure for those dynamic teams. We haven't gone out and we haven't market priced that when Mark is on the HR transformation project, that's worth X. When Mark is occupying his role as CEO of IA, that's worth Y. And when Mark is doing industry information and industry research and industry presentations, that's worth Z, for example. But the reality is there is inherent value and there is a different economic value to the work product that same individual produces. So if we really want to think about how a gig worker is paid today and how a gig worker is structured, do we just start to acknowledge that effectively we're all contingent workers? And what would that mean? We have a very large organization we're working with today that is fundamentally changing and frankly forcing their HCM vendor to get away from the traditional supervisory hierarchy because of the notion that they have to recognize that the inputs and feedback that goes into your performance review, your succession planning, your learning interventions, right? The progression of you throughout your career is frankly more representative of the work you are and the individual that you truly are if we recognize the dynamic nature of the products and services that you're producing. And if we were able to embrace this dynamic enterprise moving forward and we were able to actually substantiate that work product in our HR systems, we would have much more feedback. We have a much more common means of capturing the actual work product that you're producing every single day. Now, some of you are probably doing this in the form of dotted line relationships where you're pursuing perhaps a 360 review if I just pick on the performance review process. But the reality is that you may have multiple bosses. We just don't think about it that way. You may have multiple individuals that you work with on your team. We just don't think about it that way as overtly. So if we had the visualization and then we had the data infrastructure and the architecture to think about it, what would that mean to work? And really for those of us that work in a country where at-will employment is pretty prevalent, we tend to think about a full-time job as more permanent, but the reality that we find ourselves in COVID and recession and recession and recession and in certain vertical markets is, work isn't as protected as it used to be. The notion of a protectionist culture and that I'm going to work at one organization for the rest of my life, it does exist. It does exist. Many of you are probably largely long-tenured individuals in your respective organizations, but you've probably had 15 different roles in those organizations. We want to see the whole individual. We want to live up to this promise that we like to say in HR, that I want to recognize you for everything that you are. We need to get better in acknowledging this, and we need to think about different systems and constructs in order to effectuate that. Okay. So then we talk about this notion, and I spent a lot of time on this structure last year, so some of this may look familiar to you, but there is this thing called the war for skills, right? We talked about in prior years this old notion from probably about 20 years ago now called the war for talent, that we're fighting, the war, it's very aggressive, right? We're fighting for talent against other organizations, or we're fighting for talent even internally within our organizations. But let's talk about your role in the notion of reskilling and this common notion of a common skills taxonomy. We're working with so many organizations today that would love to look at more opportunities for rotational programs, that would love to look for more opportunities for common skill sets and to pick their talent from all around the world that has inherent skills that have been verified, has attested skills, and continues to grow through the actual work that they're producing, regardless of the kind of work that it is over the course of their career. What we don't have, and what we rarely see in any enterprise that we support, and we work with hundreds of organizations, is the lack of a common language around those skills. And if we don't think about this, if we don't have a common language around the skills that you have attained, and we don't have a common means of us either verifying or confirming, whether it's subjective or objective, that you have actually attained some level of mastery or capability in those skills. We don't have a means, therefore, of looking into the organization first and foremost to find those skilled resources who could be most appropriately applied to the work that we're trying to achieve now and in the future. And this work by the McKinsey Global Institute, this came out about a year ago. They've acknowledged that, think about this, by 2030, by the way, 2030 used to sound like the future. It's hard to believe that's 9 years from now, right? But think about 375 million people, 14% of the global workforce are going to have to change the fundamental skill mix that they have as a result of all these different movements just associated with technology advancement and technological intelligence. 375 million people. And when they started to assess where the burden will fall on that notion of reskilling, this big chunk here in the middle demonstrates that largely that burden is going to fall on corporations. Over half of it is going to fall on corporations. We bring this up because it is very common in vogue today, and we're seeing this increasingly in 2021 and expect it to continue, for organizations to say, listen, individual, we want you to own your career. HR's job is not to be your administrative assistant and to walk you, to hold your hand, manager through this process of how to manage your talent. Our job is to create the tools, the capabilities, to see you, to lift you up, and to effectuate change, right? To drive change and to give you the permission and the support and the capability to change your own career and to own your career as you move forward. That could be tuition reimbursement programs, that could be internal rotations, that could be, skills-based learning interventions, whatever it may be. Could be subjective, objective again. But corporations are going to have to play a bigger role. But if we don't have a common language and we don't have a way of identifying the skills that you even have today, how those skills can be searched, the skills that we anticipate you needing in the future, and the way in which you're going to garner those skills and can actually then publicly represent to your organization that, hey, I have the skill now. I'm a certified welder. Do you have any other positions where now at my cost, I went and got certified because I think it's a great opportunity. I'm certified in HVAC, right? Whatever it may be, I can bring that forward. I want to raise my hand and say, to the extent that there's a role that's opened up anywhere in the organization that needs those skills, please find me. The best that we can do today, and a lot of organizations do put, good effort here, is we're going to post our jobs internally. But really what we're advocating for potential solutions in this really dynamic world where people are reskilling, upskilling, relearning, and acknowledging the fact that certain roles and skills are becoming obsolete, is we need systems and solutions and a language. And we need to train our managers and our recruiters to search inward first. We had a large healthcare organization that we work with. And as a result of COVID and this headwind that we talked about where they couldn't get background checks completed, they had 750 open positions that popped toward the middle part of last year. And what did they do? They went out and they did what we're advocating for in a really inelegant way. They went to all their healthcare workers and said, tell us all the certification skills, capabilities that you have that we know nothing about, right? It wasn't part of your onboarding. It wasn't part of your job description. You haven't put it into your employee profile and your lovely modern HCM solution yet. Help us help you and help the organization by explaining all the skills you have. Now, keep in mind, some of these individuals might have been furloughed, some were temporary workers. They built a spreadsheet. In that spreadsheet, with the internal talent, the talent they already knew, people already knew their culture, their operations, their infrastructure, they were able to fill every single position. And it was funny, when I spoke to the head of HR at that organization, she said, why in the hell haven't we been doing this all along? Because the temptation in the isolation chamber of positive intent, I would add, of finding those next skilled resources, we always will look externally. We want to see the people. Let's give a platform and a language and a taxonomy where we can see these great skills and capabilities that your people already have, and let's bring them to the forefront. All right. Then we have this really super interesting notion that's really emerging pretty quickly now, this concept of portable credentialing. So we just picked on the talent acquisition lifecycle for just a moment. And some of you may have seen this slide, but I'm going to use it in a different way. So when we talk about what happens, and this is by no means representative of the 800 steps that I know candidates go through, right? But let's just talk about it at a high level, right? A candidate comes in, guess what they do? They take their resume, they break apart their entire body of experience, and what every good resume instructor and writer and career coach will tell them is match keyword for keyword, right? Take your whole body of experience, everything you know, everything you've learned, all your accomplishments, and make it very bespoke, right? Be a snowflake, make it very bespoke to the job description and the organization that you're applying to. And that's good advice. Why? Because when the application is submitted, if you have great application tracking technology, right? It's sorting, it's filtering, it's looking for keywords, it's looking for key data, and it's starting to prioritize to that issue that we talked about earlier. For the recruiters who are overwhelmed and for the hiring managers that are overwhelmed, we're trying to bubble to the top what we perceive to be the cream of the crop. It's imperfect, right? Let's talk about the flaws in that generally, because sometimes candidates don't know that they should be keyword matching. They're not aware of the fact that sentiment analysis is being applied, that artificial intelligence is using that to rate you as an A, B, or C, or say you've got a 90% match or a 98% match over your peers. But let's say somebody does it well. Right? You get these skills, you look at roles, and you look at job families. Then we have to do assessments and we have to do background checks, but that's typically a provider's taxonomy. Then we do keyword matching, then we disposition, then we do slates, we do interviews, right? We don't have a common language. It's really unstructured data. We have the subjective and objective means by which we're looking at our talent. Then we onboard and then we data map all this stuff to downstream systems, and that becomes the foundational basis for your profile. And we encourage you to put up your picture, and we hope you go in, and we hope you actually do here what we ironically incented you to not do here, which is take all the things that we don't know about you, and please tell us about them now that you're in the system. Well, guess what the problem is, right? I'm starting from not necessarily a blank sheet of paper, but I'm starting from something that's naturally funneling me. It's taking all of my Mark Stelznerisms, and it's pushing me into a funnel to make sure that as you look at me, the lens in which you're assessing me, that I'm a match, right, for the role that you're trying to occupy. Well, we just talked about the fact that roles are dynamic and that traditional supervisory hierarchies may not necessarily apply as traditionally as they have. When we talk about the notion of portable credentialing, there are organizations that out there, for example, I'd encourage you to look at Velocity Network. The good folks at Velocity Network are working with a lot of the HR technology and service providers in this market to say, well, what would happen under this notion of portable credentialing, right? That if I achieve skills, if I finished a project at company A, and let's say that my tour of duty with company A ended, right? Whether I was a contract laborer, whether I was a contingent worker, a gig worker, a full-time or a part-time employee, right? Regardless of my role and my allocation, I finish a project. Wouldn't be great if the credentials, right, the verified credentials that I earned in supporting that project or that role or initiative for that organization became portable. And therefore, I could transfer those already verified by my manager, by my team leader, however we define the notion of leadership in the future, and I could carry that forward. How much more effective would it be to streamline that portable credentialing as I move through my career journey? You know, it's not uncommon for people to change jobs, right? You know, I've got the good graces. You see my little logo. You know, I founded my firm 15 years ago. But if you look at all the different ways that I've changed this firm in the 15 years that I've had the good graces of leading it, it's changed probably 6 or 7 times. So my notion of my credentials and my applicability, even for the role that I occupy as the leader of this wonderful little firm we have, that has changed. How do we recognize the dynamic nature of work? And how do we define something that's portable? Now, some of you would say, well, isn't that what LinkedIn's for, right? That LinkedIn is a form of portable credentialing. But any of you that use the skills portion of LinkedIn, or of LinkedIn, I should say, and have gone in today, you know that some person that's sort of a second degree or third degree connection who connects with you, suddenly they endorse you for a skill. You know, Mark's great at OD. It's like, well, how would you know I'm great at OD? Person who's, you know, an IT leader that I've never met. You know, I think a lot of people do that because they're frankly trying to build a relationship. So just because you have, you know, 99, sort of the maximum number of LinkedIn network endorsements doesn't mean you know a damn thing about that particular category. So I caution the fact that, yes, LinkedIn is great and it's a great solution, but LinkedIn does not represent the portable credentialing that we're talking about. And the ability for us as an industry to come together and decide that there are certain skills or capabilities or credentials that I should really own. And again, I go back to that notion of how do we own our careers? We empower the ownership of our careers when we decide to put an investment into the individual. And one of the investments that we can make as employers, as HR service providers, as consultants, is to help to amplify the need for some form of portable credentialing that allows both verified and attested capabilities to live with the individual without this amount of subjective interpretation and purely human lift that's required to move us through, you know, this imperfect journey of our employment. So that's something that we would certainly support. And what I like about, you know, velocity is just one example, but what I like about what they've designated for this is they're calling this the Internet of Careers, right? We have the Internet of Everything. What about the Internet of Careers, and how are we thinking about that as an industry? All right. So you say, okay, these are really interesting sort of future thinking notions. We may or may not be ready. So how do we evaluate our risk, right? What is acceptable risk? So, you know, we can pick on this notion of conditional concepts. So let's talk about the background check. So we talked about the court systems are closed. You know, you certainly have the option to make a conditional offer. So is that acceptable to your candidates and hiring managers? In some cases, frankly, we don't have a lot of choice here. We'll have to make a conditional offer. That offer may be conditional on clearing your background check, but in our risk portfolio, our personal risk portfolio and our corporate risk portfolio, right, is that acceptable to our candidates, our hiring managers? And is the notion of anything, right, that we think about potentially that may be conditional, is that something that we're embracing overtly? And are we acknowledging the fact that there is some risk associated with that? Not only risk to us, but risk to the candidates and individuals that we're working with, right? We talk about this notion of fairness and consistency. And I think this is something that just warrants a little bit more time in our industry, right? Can we apply the same rules to everybody? So when we think about this notion of consistency, you know, what we should do for one, we should do for all. Now you can say what we do for one, we do for all is different by perhaps job group or by geography, because there are different requirements, statutory requirements, legal and legislative requirements, certainly in the geographies in which you operate. But can you apply the same rules to everyone? And think of it this way. If you didn't apply to the same rules for everyone and someone found that out, how would you feel? How would you react? You know, this is part of the same debate around pay transparency, right? Are we not being transparent about pay because we don't like the conversation that we would have to justify why we don't have pay consistency and pay transparency across our different populations? Are we prepared to justify the exceptions Or do we acknowledge that, frankly, everyone is an exception? So, when we think about these processes and we think about these risks, how do we think about consistency? My example of dynamic teams, how do we think about the consistency of dynamic teams? How do we apply dynamic teams to organizations and constructs that perhaps are more traditional? How do we create those same opportunities for mobility and skill sets for everyone, regardless of where you fall in the organizational hierarchy? Do we think about clarity, right? So I'll talk about offer letters here, right? Are they explicitly clear and are they in compliance? Compliance is changing. One of the benefits, I would say, of COVID, if there are any, is that we have moved from very heavy regulated processes where we have accepted things like DocuSign and checkbox attestations. What's funny about the legal community in some respects is we spend more time, as we should perhaps, as an HR profession, thinking about the policies and making sure that our employees are educated and everything, than you probably do ever reading the 800 apps that you have installed on your phone. We give away more of our personal information by not reading the privacy considerations of the social media platforms that we participate in than we think about the privacy of information over the four walls of our employers that we support. So we have this weird cognitive dissonance between how we behave as consumers. And I'm not saying everybody behaves that way, but largely, right? When you install an app, you're probably scroll, 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 accept. Oh, it's going to make me scroll this time? Okay, scroll, 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 accept. You're not reading those words because why? You feel like you don't have a choice. Are we making this very difficult, right? Are we being clear? Are we directing people to the support resources that they have? But are we trusting people to be adults, right? And to use the information to the best of their ability? So are you being really clear about how you're approaching certain issues? Are you drawing people's attention in advance to the sites where they can study, how they can be more compliant? Are you supporting the resources necessary that if someone has a very unique circumstance, that's where we put our HR effort forward? But short of that, sort of supporting the exceptions, providing the right information to the right individuals, can we get ourselves out of the whack-a-mole hole of this transactional processing by explicit clarity, by using technology to assemble the right information and not putting our limited human effort in the HR function into these processes, elevating ourselves and by virtue elevating our function to be more transformative in the roles that we occupy. There are tools, there are tech, there is an ability for us to scrape this from various sources, and we can be much, much more robust. And I would challenge you, therefore, when it comes to clarity, and I'm just picking on offer letters, this could be for anything, you certainly can't outsource your accountability, but you can push your external service providers, those that are providing the various forms of technology and service provisioning in your ecosystem, to do more for you, to thread this information more explicitly into these moments that matter, to bring it into the form of work that I'm occupying in that moment. We tend to think about, HR as a result of our centers of excellence. People are working in the flow of work, right? We're thinking performance, right? Which goes to comp and merit planning, which goes to the bonus pool, et cetera. Guess what? People are living their lives and they're like, here comes the performance evaluation. Why are we doing continuous performance conversations? Because we're sick of this once a year process. That's not how work really works. So let's think about clarity, consistency, and these conditional approaches throughout all of our processes. And finally, correction, right? If we have to take remediation under consideration, if we have to take corrective action, let's focus on those exceptions, but let's not make those exceptions the rule. And let's think about those impacts to stakeholders. My team and I, we do a tremendous amount of work in process mapping where we break apart. We're like HR private investigators, right? We do this forensic work, breaking apart processes. I would say that 60% of the processes that our clients tend to focus on are the exceptions, and 40% are in fact the rules. And once you've built this process map that you can't unsee because you realize there are 1,475 different steps for your off-cycle payroll, real use case, guess what you're going to do? You're going to get lean. And you're going to realize, wow, if there is corrective action, that's a great place for human intervention. But short of that, let's manage to the rule. And let's think about the positive and negative impacts of corrections and corrective actions associated with these risk portfolios in the flow of work, always in the flow of work. Okay. And this is true for all shapes and sizes, right? One of the things we talk about for some of the emerging organizations that we work with that are, let's say 500 or 1,000 employees, is we feel like our job is for you to prevent HR transformation, right? You shouldn't have to call us. And how do you do that? You start to think about some of these constructs ahead of time. While you're still small and you're growing, how do you think about a common language for your skill set, right? How do you think about the dynamic nature of work? How do you think about your risk and balance your risk portfolio so you're managing not everything to risk, but you're managing to a limited amount of risk? and you're counting on your people to be adults, right? Your employees and your managers. And get away from this protectionist culture that sometimes that we find ourselves in. Let's free up HR. Let's contemplate this notion of portable credentialing, and let's empower our employees to really live and thrive to the ethos, right? The ethos that we scream from the top of the rooftops, that our employees are our most important assets. And let's empower employees and managers, and let's move HR forward as a result. You all have worked your asses off, right, as HR professionals, and it's not slowing down. It's frankly getting worse. And HR largely is owning the COVID response for your organizations as well. So there's more to come. We've got to shed the burdens that we shouldn't have ever been responsible for, and we've got to be able to move this down to the individuals who should be owning their teams, or should be owning their individual careers. We have to do so with an intentional acknowledgement that we have an imperfect system to support that today. So this is a glide path. This is likely a multi-year journey, but you're not too small to take on these initiatives, and frankly, no one is too big to start shaping the future today. So with that, what I'd like to do in the interest of time, I want you to connect to Mary, by the way. Mary had, unfortunately, a very rough, unexpected afternoon today. So please do reach out to Mary on Twitter, connect with her on LinkedIn, send her your best regards, and please connect with me as well. I'd love to hear from you all offline. But with that, maybe I could open it up back to our great support team and see if there are any questions that came up over the course of today's conversation.
Sure. We got one question right here to start off with. What daylight report date is this information from?
For which, I'm sorry, I'm not sure for which report. Well, let's do this actually in the interest of time. What I'll do is we'll make sure that you guys get a copy of this presentation, and we'll make sure that in the notes of the presentation, all the links to all the studies and reports are actually in there for all of you. So the reports from the International Monetary Fund, from any of the sources that we cited, for everybody, for all the source material, we'll make sure all those links are in every single slide so you all can run forward and do some further research. But thank you for the question. Okay.
That is the only question I am, oh, we got another, oh, maybe. You advocate for common language taxonomy. There are some in the market saying skip the taxonomy and go straight to ontology. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it's an interesting problem. So we're seeing, for example, that there are some really interesting tools out there that are starting to extract using natural language, right? These are artificial intelligence tools that are starting to extract from the job descriptions themselves a natural language so that we don't have to be as prescriptive in the way in which we define our taxonomy. And I like it. I like the concept of it in terms of current state efficiency. The challenge I have, unfortunately, which is part of the problem statement that I conveyed a little bit earlier, is that therefore we're only as good as the notional job descriptions that we're defining today. And we're talking to some organizations today, and this is sort of fascinating, right? Is the job description even relevant anymore? And you may question, well, how would we market price? How would we think about roles? How would we convey expectations? And some organizations are basically simplifying their job descriptions to sort of the basic tenets of what they expect the role to occupy, but keeping it very fluid and open-ended. And I like the notion of a different means of deriving the same intelligence. And where this gets exacerbated is when we think about global workforces. And some of you may be hyper-localized to certain geographies, but when we think about the implications of a global taxonomy, it's a big problem, right? And there are organizations that are trying to work on this today. So I would draw your attention, for example, there's a great organization out of the UK called Burning Glass, and they're trying to derive this common taxonomy. And they're not even calling it a taxonomy, by the way. So I like the pushback around the notion of, or is thinking about this as a skills taxonomy the right way to think about it, because it's an evolving concept. But again, if I look at the work that Burning Glass is doing, I mentioned LinkedIn earlier, LinkedIn's doing this. If you're a Workday customer, Workday is trying to develop their own sense of a common language as well. But we have to think about the global implications of what things mean. I was talking to LinkedIn about this 2 years ago, and they were joking about the fact that when we talk about Python, right? Python means one thing, obviously, if you're an IT developer, but it means something else if you work for your local zoo. So how do we use the notion of the fluid nature of language and the interpretive components of language to actually represent the same types of outcomes. So I love the question because this is a really complex topic. I guess I would encourage, I'd love to talk to that individual offline if they'd reach out to me, because there is so much emerging in the research, but we have to start with those that are either trying to derive this common language or have declared, to the extent that you're using our platform or using our shared platform through industry associations that are starting to come together and attack this, that's at least a running start to attack perhaps 25 to 50% of the problem that we see. But wonderful question and challenge. Thank you so much.
All right, so the next question said, you said C-suite turnover is high. Are they retiring or what?
I wish I knew. It's funny. I've talked to a couple former C-suite members, a couple, I'd say, let's say a sample size of a couple dozen over the course of the last 6 to 8 months. Like all of us, I think what has happened in the world has taken its pound of flesh out on the C-suite as well. It's commonly said, but I'll just spend a moment on this. Being in the C-suite is a pretty lonely position. It is a position of power. There are tremendous risks and tremendous rewards, right? We have great issues with pay parity, right? The percentage of pay for, let's say, our C-suite executives relative to our lowest paid employees. But if you think about the job of a CHRO, if any CHROs are out there, I'd love your feedback afterwards. You are not only the face of HR and therefore have to present a persona and represent and embody everything that your organization claims to be important for the impetus of your employee value proposition and what it means to be a leader in the organization. But you are also the trusted advisor, right? The counselor to every single other member of the C-suite. But I spent a lot of time last year talking to CHROs who simply needed a place to cry. And I'm not exaggerating. This isn't conjecture. It's because it's not safe, right, to show weakness. And it's an unfortunate thing that we're seeing some safety now expressed by certain leaders in certain industries who are talking, let's say, about mental well-being and mental illness, who are talking about addiction, who are declaring, right, from their top of the house, that it is hard, that life is hard and life is heavy and life just impacts on all of us. And we're seeing some really brave examples of individuals. I've talked about this before. We have one CEO we work with who talked about the importance of emotional well-being and gave out his email address and his personal cell phone number. And he got 14,000 inquiries in 10 days, 14,000 inquiries. But as leaders, right, the burden of leadership is real. And I think, frankly, that this last period has taken out a lot on those leaders. I would also say if you're a public entity, the public markets are pretty relentless and unforgiving. And we're in a weird place in the public markets where the pressure, right, to maintain disproportionately high evaluations, to live in that 90-day life cycle, it can churn even the most capable and storied C-suite executive. And the last thing I'll add beyond just burnout and being part of the public market is the fact that businesses are shifting, or having to shift out of both necessity and design with unprecedented speed, like the pivot, right? I'm not a big fan of the consulting word pivot, but call it the pivot, right? We've had to pivot and move into a different direction. And oftentimes that alone can be a catalyst to bring in new leadership, because you want someone perhaps that has some body of experience moving toward the destination that is your new destination for that business unit or for that function. And so all of that combines to say, they might be burnt out, they might be exhausted, their skills may be no longer needed, they may not be performing to the unbelievably heavy expectations of a public or private board. And that turnover sometimes is necessary to frankly breed new ideas and bring new joiners and new perspectives into some organizations that frankly need to be shaken up. And we see that need for a shakeup largely in the HR parlance, I would say, in the concept of diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? Organizations that continue to come to light that have unfortunately behaved inappropriately for, in some cases, decades and decades and decades. So an infusion of new talent, a catalyst for change for new talent at the C-suite isn't always a bad thing. But we also have to acknowledge that that fundamentally shapes the people structure, the people organization, and what is expected of every single contributor to that organization in a very foundational way. And that's another way why we talk about, work is very fluid and dynamic. And those changes, right, I don't care what that person owns, that will have a cascading impact on your population writ large. But thank you for the question.
All right. Dynamic teams concept is so spot on. Do you see organizations who are doing this effectively, retraining slash reskilling leaders to learn how to manage virtual teams? Any examples of how it is being applied would be great.
Yeah, no, wonderful question. Thank you for that. So it's funny, the first thing we almost have to do is acknowledge that it exists. And it's a weird thing to say that that's part of building toward a successful dynamic teaming structure. But if we're intentional about acknowledging the nature of dynamic teams, then we're going to start asking really interesting questions that shape the next process. So if we acknowledge that we're working in a dynamic environment and we've never really addressed it, then part of it is, okay, well, what are the constructs that we believe are most appropriate to determine one's participation in a dynamic structure? The easiest thing to start with might be project-based work. And every organization is probably going through some form of transformative growth or restructuring right now. So as a result, if we just pick our project teams, and let's say we pilot it, and this is where a lot of this dynamic teaming concept really was born from. You know, Accenture built this notion of the liquid workforce years ago, but it never caught on. And I think because the speed of transformation wasn't quite as acute as it is today. But if we focus on, let's say, our project teams, let's say you're putting in, I'll just pick on HR, we're putting in a new enterprise-wide global HCM system. And we have business unit advisors that we want part of that project. We have subject matter experts, right? We have a combination of IT, finance, and HR personnel. And if we look at the fractional allocation of those subject matter experts and key stakeholders into the entire project plan, and we did nothing more than to isolate to that particular time horizon, let's say it's a 12-month transformation, and we acknowledge that Mary is going to be 40% allocated to that. And we went into Mary's profile and we said, okay, Mary, for the next 12 months, I'm going to allocate 40% of your capacity to this dynamic team. And even if you don't have a system that could do this, you put it on a spreadsheet. You would then acknowledge, like, wow, that means that 40% of Mary's capacity isn't here to be a principal leading HR transformations for the Fortune 1000. So what would that mean for Mary? That means I need to be very careful about the work product that Mary is supporting today in her current role as an HR subject matter expert. Okay, so what do I do with that 40%? Well, now I need to look across the team and say, how do I allocate that 40% of work product? Does it mean we're no longer doing that work? Does it mean I'm bringing in contingent labor to support perhaps the more transactional nature of that work that Mary can no longer support to free up her 60%? And if you're following what I'm saying, it really starts with being intentional and starting to document the actual work product and the flows and interdependencies. Because even for something as small, right, these are big projects, but as small as a global HR transformation project, you start to realize that, wow, the cascading impact of that one project may be impacting dozens, if not hundreds of individuals. And you start to build a little bit of muscle around the necessity to think more dynamically about your teams. So if you document that work product, you think about the fact that, wow, you know, Mark is Mary's supervisor, but really what I want is I want 40% of Mary's, you know, performance to come from that team leader. Okay, well, how do we think about dynamic performance management? Well, Mary gets certified in that HCM platform, and maybe she's part of the ongoing service delivery. Well, what's the market value of being certified in that particular platform? You know, as an HR expert who's doing configuration and doing release management and consumability and UAT testing, right? And you can follow me here. So it starts with just identifying one particular initiative, pick a pilot group, identify the use cases, right? Break apart the individuals, acknowledge the fractional allocation, figure out the work product that will be picked up by those other fractional components that now need to be cared for, and start to build a muscle and start to build momentum. And from that, then you can start to think about systems and processes and a more overt way of acknowledging that every time a new project comes up, we're clear about the give to get in terms of work to productivity. So that would be a running start. And happy again for that individual to reach out offline and we could talk particular specifics about those use cases.
So I do believe that is all the time that we have for questions for today's event.
All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Enjoyed the conversation. Please do keep in touch. Love to hear from you. Good, bad, or indifferent. Let us know how we did today. We'll be sure to make sure that the materials are in your hands. I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for spending an hour with me today.